Good afternoon, Chairperson Cobb, Councilor Members Fife, Gayo, and other city and community members I can't see. Clerk Parker Trigg, thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you for running a successful meeting. And let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Nola Agha. I'm a full professor of sport management at the University of San Francisco, and I've published theoretical, empirical, and conceptual research on economic impact in sport for over 20 years. In late August of 2022, because no independent analysis had yet been conducted on the A's project, PMSA asked me to evaluate the A's proposal against what is known from years of academic study on stadiums across the globe. I took this opportunity to share my expertise and help inform the discussion around the public funding of an A's ballpark development. The following slides summarize my report and facts that have been made public by the city. Sports economists are people who love sports so much that they study it for a living. They evaluate stadium developments after they're built to calculate their actual effects. These scholars have written hundreds of research papers for 35 years. This well-established field of study reaches near consistent conclusions. Sport does not benefit a local economy in ways that are typically promised in terms of jobs, income, or development. Now, this is the point that stadium proponents will accuse me of being a hired hack. It's certainly the point at which my students look at me with shock and skepticism. Why is this so hard to believe? Well, we've all seen headlines touting hundreds of millions of economic impact from teams or stadiums, but no one publishes headlines from academics who evaluate it afterwards and find no such impact. This lack of impact is also hard to believe because we visually see enormous crowds around stadiums. We see spending and gains. Yet a mid-sized grocery store in the Bay Area has over 1 million unique visitors each year and does more business than the A's, but we don't see a store on the nightly news. So we perceive sports to have larger impacts than reality. In addition, most of the economic activity around sports is substituted from elsewhere in the economy, but we can't see the substitution. The businesses that close, the people who stay home instead of going out in traffic. For example, there are multiple studies on hotel stays, the most important of which looks at the Staples Center, a classic example of mixed use. They find hotel stays increase nearby, but fall further away for a zero net gain. Multiple studies find retail sales might increase near a sport development, but they fall elsewhere. And multiple studies find no net gain in businesses in cities that build new stadiums. In addition to substitution, we see these non-positive effects because a stadium moving from one side of the city to another does not generate enough new incremental revenue to fund its high cost. Expenditures that would have occurred at the zoo or Grand Lake Theater or in Rockridge and benefited the general fund can be geographically redistributed to the new development and into special tax districts that capture those revenues and spend them on the sport development instead of on previous city needs. Oakland residents won't suddenly have more money to spend if the A's build a new stadium. So any new revenues will have to come from people outside of Oakland. But this is where you do a common sense check. Is this promise of new revenue likely in a location with virtually no parking and no BART access? How many people from Walnut Creek or San Jose will take BART to West Oakland and walk 1 mile to Howard Terminal? Finally, the time and spatial concentration of sport events leads to disruptions that can and will affect other businesses. Now, the idea that a stadium and the businesses and residents around it will be catalysts to attract new spending is appealing. But because other stadiums with mixed use development have been built in tax districts, they've been studied to see if this idealistic notion has come true, and it has not. A brief example that is comparable in form to Howard Terminal is found in Atlanta. It's a $400 million year-round commercial center with residential, hotel, and retail spaces. Pre-construction estimates predicted so much new economic activity that there would be $6 to $19 million in annual benefit. They also used special tax districts, including hotel and property taxes, to provide subsidies. 3 separate studies on this development found commercial property value growth was the same as other commercial districts in Atlanta. Most of the revenues in the development were reallocated from other county level spending, which harmed other local merchants. Typical of nearly all publicly funded sport projects, the development was a net drain on the budget. The subsidy far exceeded any observed benefits, and any seeming gains were primarily local substitution. So now let's discuss Howard Terminal. I used the results from hundreds of academic studies, published comparables, and basic increases for inflation to make reasonable shifts in numbers previously calculated for the project. There are 145 footnotes in my report citing my sources. Before getting into the details, I'll begin with a question. So hypothetically, let's say you and your friend go to Arthur Max for lunch. Your friend pays the whole bill with a credit card, and then you send them your portion via Venmo. Who paid for lunch? Just because your friend physically paid the actual bill doesn't mean you got a free lunch. You paid and your bank balance just got lower. We're seeing this kind of verbal gymnastics when we discuss the reimbursement for the on-site infrastructure that the city will be paying the A's. The city will be paying, and this is a sports subsidy. Now, I'm a teacher, so forgive me for using another analogy, but let's say that the same friend sends you a message saying that they've snagged reservations for the French Laundry. Now, you've no car, so you're going to have to get yourself to Napa during rush hour in a Lyft. You're going to need to pay hundreds of dollars for transportation each direction, plus hundreds of dollars for dinner, and you will have to pay for all of it. Now, a good friend who understood your financial constraints probably wouldn't ask you to go to the French Laundry. They suggest walking over to Hot Boys instead. But since the invite to the French Laundry is on the table, you need to decide if you're going to get into that Lyft. So let's evaluate this proposition. In the context of the A's, the Coliseum is 155 acres of land with ample parking and public transportation. Yet the A's have selected an exceptionally complicated parcel of land to build their new stadium. It's bounded by water, a rail line, and a working port, meaning every single person that visits the site will have to cross water or a rail line to reach there. The site is subject to future sea level rise. There's no BART, public transportation, virtually no parking. And so people movement will lead to disruptions that will affect port fluidity, as well as create safety issues for people. Remember, 30% of game day parking is in downtown Oakland on the opposite side of 880, creating disruption to the core business district well beyond Jack London Square. All of these site features require exceptionally expensive solutions, more expensive even than a visit to the French Laundry. Importantly, it's the site features, not necessarily the square footage of what will be built there, that most affects the details of the public finance component. The A's will build the buildings, but they've asked the city to pay for all of the other costs in order for the A's to build on this exceptionally complicated parcel of land. Current conservative estimates put this sports subsidy over $1.2 billion. Now, specifically, in terms of on-site infrastructure, the costs are risky, rising, high, and unknown. Although the previous $100 million cost of environmental cleanup has now been replaced by cost-effective capping, there's a risk that sea level rise, turning basin expansion, or construction will unearth other problems. The Washington Nationals ballpark, built on former industrial Navy yards, saw cleanup costs go over budget by nearly 10%. Clearly, inflation, interest rates, and cost of capital are currently increasing. Due to its complicated location, the on-site infrastructure must include seaport compatibility measures, flood mitigation, and environmental cleanup. More importantly, what's being built is unknown. It changes in each public disclosure and is currently described as eligible capital improvements. Now, if the scope doesn't change and everything goes perfectly, I applied inflation to estimate that it would cost $603 million by 2025. But studies of other stadiums show costs are always underestimated. And hopefully you can see that there's plenty of opportunity for this to go even higher for any of these reasons. Regardless of how the actual costs go, they must be built. So nothing will reduce the amount of infrastructure that must be constructed, for which the city will ultimately pay. Now, one approach to determining the taxpayer subsidy for on-site infrastructure is what I just illustrated, trying to estimate the total cost and then deciding how much the city is willing to reimburse. Another approach is to determine how much revenue the project will generate and then decide if the city will return any of it to the developer. In this case, the revenues are also unknown. They change from 57% of $860 million reimbursed to the A's to a single annual value, which if I multiply it by 45 years equals $521 million, but is absolutely an incorrect way to compute the total. A proper and complete financial model over a 45-year period would account for when the project features would be completed, when they'll be fully leased or sold, with best, mid, and worst case scenarios that account for the negative financial headwinds. But none of it's happened or has not been made public, which leaves us with the July 21 term sheet, which shows that 80% of proceeds are going to be reimbursed. But what are the expected proceeds? Does the city still project 860 million? Is it 512? We don't know. The question remains, how much tax revenue will the city reimburse the A's? And regardless of whether I try to estimate the costs or the revenues, the direct subsidy is suffering from a lack of specificity. The amount ultimately provided to the A's will depend on the total cost of the on-site infrastructure that is eligible for reimbursement, which is unknown and rising, and the proportion of total project revenues that are set aside for reimbursements, which is also unknown. This situation does not benefit taxpayers. In addition, there's no contractual maximum on the public subsidy, nor is there a guaranteed minimum number of units to be built. The city says the A's have an incentive to build because it increases the pool of money that can be reimbursed to them. But consider the Atlantic Yards project in Brooklyn, where 1 year after all of the associated development was supposed to have been built, less than 20% was complete. Things can go wrong. The cost of borrowing can be too high. The team can also leave Oakland or demand a new stadium in 25 years, but the city will pay the A's for a total of 45 years. When considering an IFD as a funding mechanism, remember that just because the tax revenues are being generated doesn't mean they should all be returned to the project developer. In this case, the public contribution is out of line with what other cities are reimbursing developers in the Bay Area. San Jose is only reimbursing 17% on $1 billion in infrastructure. I would ask, if there was no stadium here, would the city reimburse this housing project at 100%? Or is this how Oaklanders want the city to allocate hundreds of millions of dollars in new property tax revenues for the next 45 years? Right now, it's a blank check. It's an unknown amount for an unknown items for on-site infrastructure. Let's shift gears and talk about off-site infrastructure, which, by the way, is only needed because of the site location. And the infrastructure is very expensive because of the site features. How much will it cost? Well, no one knows for sure because what has to be built is unknown. The city has only conceptual drawings with which to make their estimates. We also don't know how much because costs are rising. When Town for All was released in 2021, it was unclear to me whether it subsumes every Howard Terminal project, including seaport compatibility measures and environmental impact mitigations. The city's most recent estimate is $600 million, but their preferred 6% inflation, taking it to $715 million by 2025. My estimate in my report was derived from the most recent value at the time, which was $500 million, plus 23% producer price index for the final construction demand, adjustments for infrastructure that were not explicitly included in Town for All, bringing it to $850 million by 2025. Now, in 2022, the City Council approved a resolution directing staff to continue to engage port stakeholders on seaport compatibility measures, including any recommended changes. If the city is still negotiating in good faith with all the stakeholders, then there's a likelihood that more compatibility measures will be needed. And even if you disagree with my estimates of inflation or costs, they're indisputable facts. First, decades of research on sport projects shows that pre-construction costs are always underestimated. And second, in the words of the city administrator's office, the cost will keep rising on projects that are not fully defined. Common sense and a look at this list of current growth suggests $850 million is not implausible, or at minimum will be at least $715 million if a building commences in 2025. So similar to the on-site infrastructure, there are many negative economic headwinds, none of which will reduce the amount that the city must build or what it will cost. The off-site costs rely entirely on taxpayer funds. And as illustrated earlier, the proposal to use a limited obligation bond will affect the general fund. If the A's move across town into an IFD or an LOB zone, a birthday party that I would have had at Fairyland or Grand Lake Theater that becomes a birthday party at Howard Terminal will cause a decrease in the city's general fund as those expenditures are moved into a zone that allocates them to the A's. So despite the best efforts of the city to obtain grants, they're far from what's needed. In September of 2022, the city had been awarded $52 million, felt certain they would be able to secure $321 million. And in December of this year indicated they were now pursuing 307 more. It does not appear sufficient. And remember, the actual items are still unknown and will likely keep increasing. So if we move on from fiscal impact to the city and we circle back to the last 2 points on economic impact, I'll reinforce that the team moving across town is simple geographic relocation of spending. New activity would require businesses or residents from outside of Oakland, and in such great numbers that it would make up for any local revenue losses. Research specifically on this topic finds stadium development does not increase the number of people who move to the area. And if anything, they actually decrease because the city now has less to spend on non-stadium amenities that make better livable cities. And these are the other disruptions that we can't see. We can't see the people who opt not to move to Oakland because city amenities continue to decrease. We can't see the people who won't go to Jock and Square restaurants on game day because there's no parking or special event parking is $100. We can't see the disruption to other non-port related local businesses in the area that offer auto repair and coffee roasting, plumbing supplies, cabinets, building design, elevators, publishing, and more. They will all be impacted by game day crowds who make it challenging for their typical customers to conduct business. And of course, the port. The city appointed managers of the Point of Oakland disagree with their port tenants on most aspects of this project, but they do agree that the undisputed need of a port is efficiently moving cargo without disruption. And even with hundreds of millions in mitigations, there's still a very real risk of disruptions. Using data from the port's own economic impact study, I estimated that just one container ship less each week results in the loss of 207 jobs, 18 million in wages, and 107 million in business revenue at the port. And this only assumes interruption to a small part of the port and only losses to Oakland. The negative impact could be much greater. Before a project occurs, no one has a crystal ball. So I can't tell you if it will be the coffee roaster or the elevator company that will go out of business. I can't tell you if it'll be one diverted container ship or two. But when academics look at stadium projects after they're built, the data shows any gains are wiped out by a corresponding loss. Finally, let's discuss the intangibles. Is it worth it to spend money on a public good? I would say absolutely. We spend money on libraries and roads and parks and services that improve our communities. But multiple studies show that governments spend more on stadiums than the teams are worth to their residents. If the team is worth 300 million, the city might pay 500. They overpay, and we see that here. The public contribution for Howard Terminal is beyond what other cities are reimbursing developers in the Bay Area with IFDs. It's also out of line with other sports projects. You can see here two recent mixed-use projects, the Warriors and SoFi in California, plus the most recent Bay Area Major League Baseball stadium. Why does this project deserve over 1.2 billion when other teams in California have recently built mixed-use development without public support? Also note the costs are always underestimated, even by private developers. SoFi was 100% over budget, and Chase Center was 40%. Okay. The fear of losing a team can pressure local governments to enter into contractual terms that they wouldn't agree to for other development projects and that are entirely suboptimal for the community. Oakland has an incredible number of pressing public service needs, and clearly elected officials must make trade-offs when spending taxpayer money. Okay. You're currently being asked to spend over $1 billion on infrastructure or 3,000 units. The trade-off might be spending less to build even more units in a different location that won't disrupt the regional economic activity of the port or downtown central business district. Finally, there's the fear of losing a team because of relocation threats and negotiations with other cities that are designed to increase pressure on you to approve deals that are not in the best interest of the city.